Thank you so much for joining us for Spirit, the stimulating program initiative for retirees that inspires the what. I'm Judy Steinig, Director of Community Programs for the Orthodox Union, and it's my honor to coordinate and host this program. The OU created Spirit several years ago as an on-site program, and now we're happy to present it as a virtual program for baby boomers, active retirees, not yet retirees, empty nesters, sandwich generation parents, and seniors, all of whom are looking for opportunities for spiritual, educational, and intellectual growth. Since we are all still sheltering in because of the pandemic, Spirit is the perfect way to engage in a virtual setting. Today's program is a very special event with a packed house on Zoom. We are very honored and privileged to welcome Rabbi BEREL WEIN to our Spirit program. Rabbi WEIN needs no introduction. For many, many years, we have been enjoying listening to his history lessons and reading his many, many books. His website, jewishdestiny.com, from the Destiny Foundation, is a wealth of Jewish history. Today, he will speak on American Jewry Turns the Corners, the 1950s. Thank you so much, Rabbi WEIN. It is a privilege to have you here with us. Rabbi WEIN? Oh, Rabbi WEIN, you're muted again. Can you have your... Okay, everybody will hold tight. Rabbi WEIN will be with us shortly. And there's still more people coming in. It's still muted. Wait, Allison, you need to unmute Rabbi WEIN. Allison, wait. Wait. Please unmute Rabbi WEIN.
I cannot find him here.
Wait, it's under Surrey Teitelbaum. Do you see? Surrey Teitelbaum. Thank you, Rebbitzin. Do you see her? There, okay.
Okay, we're good.
We're good, okay. Thank you, Rabbi WEIN. Yes,
Go ahead,
we're ready for you.
The 1950s has to be seen in the context of what happened in the 1940s. In other words, the attempt to somehow rebuild the Jewish world after the Shoah. And that had enormous impact on the 1950s, had an enormous impact on the Jewish world because 1/3 of the Jewish people were destroyed. Everyone felt that there was really very little that we could do about it. Now, on the opposite side, the state of Israel had been declared in 1948. And therefore, the hope of the Jewish people generally, and certainly of the non-Orthodox world, lay with the state of Israel. Now, in 1950 in America, the day school movement was just taking hold. And there were these day schools created throughout the United States. And it was a radical idea. Jews were devoted to the public school system. And the public school system at that time was the melting pot. Everybody was going to become an American. And becoming an American meant, to a certain extent, certainly not emphasizing your Judaism and even foregoing a lot of it. And here came the day school movement, and it asked that Jewish children have schools of their own, and that they not go to the public schools. Not going to the public schools was then held to be almost anti-American. It was, in many circles, it was equated with disloyalty, that you were not doing anything positive to advance the cause of Americanizing the Jews in America. And that was the official position of what we would call established Judaism. The establishment was basically Reform. It certainly was non-Orthodox. It certainly wasn't friendly to the Orthodox. And it believed that the Orthodox were going to disappear. In 1950, Look magazine, so Look magazine has disappeared. The Orthodox have not. But in 1950, Look magazine wrote a long article about the future of American Jewry. And they said that at best it'll be conservative, but it most probably will be Reform, and that the Orthodox will disappear completely. And that was the opinion of the establishment, the federations, who originally very bitterly opposed the day school movement and would not finance it. So it really is a remarkable achievement that the day school movement took hold, that somehow, against all odds and in all sorts of places, it became viable. In Detroit and Cleveland, Miami, in Los Angeles, in Chicago, not just on the East Coast. And this created a whole sea change in Jewish life, because there now arose a confidence in the future. And it's interesting to note that to a great extent, not 100%, but to a great extent, the people who made this happen were themselves the refugees from the Shoah, who arrived in the United States in the late 1940s and early 1950s, and who were determined somehow that the Judaism and Jewish knowledge that they knew in their youth would be revived and would function. And therefore, it was an injection, I would say a blood transfusion of these devoted people. So the Hasidic movement took hold. The Lubavitcher Rebbe came into being and as a force. The yeshivas started to grow, Baron Cutler, And these were different forms of the Orthodox world. Baron Cutler initiated what later can be called the Kollel system in America. And Lakewood became a great and populous yeshiva. I remember Lakewood when Reb Aaron began, so he had 27 students. And there was a ramshackle farmhouse that a Jewish lady, Lantz lady, she came from the same town, and she knew Reb Aaron. She gave it to him. But the building is still there. So Reb Aaron, he didn't imagine that there would be 9,000 students in Beit Medrash L'Gavola. And even Yeshiva University then was a rather small institution. Now, Dr. Belkin made a revolution. The Albert Einstein Medical School was an absolute revolution. And it was not only a revolution for the Albert Einstein Medical School, but because of the Albert Einstein Medical School, other medical schools created programs that Sabbath observant students could partake in and gain their medical degrees. I cannot tell you what a change that was, because my generation, you couldn't get into medical school, not just, they weren't going to give you off Shabbos. There was a quota and you couldn't get in. So Jewish doctors were forced to make their own medical schools. I remember in Chicago, the Chicago Medical School, because you couldn't get into the regular medical schools. But a Sabbath observant medical school, I remember there were 3 young men from the yeshiva in Chicago who went to medical school. Every Shabbat, they walked miles and miles because they had to attend classes. You had to have someone take notes for you. It was an enormously difficult task. I know there are many Jews that never get their due, that did not get their due. Dr. Belkin is one of them. I mean, for that alone. And because of that, therefore, Orthodoxy took on a new life. You had a future. You saw that it could be. Now, the Orthodox communities were pretty much ravaged by the demographic change in the big cities. And the Jewish neighborhoods collapsed. I know from Chicago, where I came from, so in the old neighborhood, there were 40, in the Lawndale neighborhood, the west side, there were 42 Orthodox synagogues. 42. And major synagogues with great rabbonim, almost all of whom were European born. The American rabbinate had not yet come into its full form. And when the neighborhood changed, as it did, only 6 survived. And it was a very, very touch and go situation whether any would survive. And there were no positions for young men from the yeshivas that were going to go into the rabbinate. Basically, if you wanted to go into the rabbinate, except for certain pockets, especially in the East Coast, in the New York area, but otherwise there were no positions available for Orthodox rabbis. And whatever positions there were very meager. So the new neighborhoods had to recreate themselves. Now, in the process of recreating themselves, there was a certain confidence because you were beginning anew. So even though the vast majority then attended conservative synagogues, the few Orthodox that made their synagogues did so with a confidence, with an optimism, almost an unrealistic optimism, that they would be the future and that they would not only survive, but that they would prosper. And in addition to this, very strong idea was the fact that intensive Torah study would be the solution to many Jewish problems. And this was because you had, again, these Eastern European teachers, Rosh Yeshiva, in all the institutions. I know when I went to the yeshiva in Chicago, every one of my teachers was from Lithuania. And they brought with them, some of them, 3, 4 of them were Holocaust survivors. They brought with them not just the knowledge, but the flavor of Eastern European Jewry. You know, in Yiddish they say there's a geschmack. There's a flavor to it, an aura to it. And that itself was also inspirational. I don't remember exactly every word that my teachers taught me, but I remember my teachers. And I remember the warmth and the optimism and the almost otherworldliness that they created so that you were not destroyed by what looked like the demise of Orthodox Judaism. I think it's also important to point out that in the 1950s is when the OU got hold of kashrus in America and changed it. Until then, kashrus was in the hands of private rabbis, mainly. And there was no standard system. I remember when I grew up in Chicago, there was no shortening that was kosher that you could use. My mother used chicken fat, which was cholesterol heaven. And I have to mention Rabbi Alexander Rosenberg of blessed memory, who was the founder of the OU kashrus. And he standardized it and he brought it to great companies. So that Procter and Gamble and Colgate and General Foods and Pillsbury, all of the gigantic food companies in America now became kosher. And you could see the kashrus on the box. I remember the great joy that my mother had when she saw an OU on the Crisco label. And we had shortenings. We didn't have to have chicken fat anymore. And that's just a minor example. And so that's a revolution. Today, we take it for granted. You know, if you go in Europe, everybody's still got to go with a book to see which products, what, you know. In the United States, we can go, you know, I was in Maui once with my wife and went to the supermarket. We bought the whole Shabbos. Everything was OU. A remarkable, remarkable accomplishment. And that accomplishment fed into the renewed optimism of orthodoxy. Look what could be done. Procter & Gamble thought it was important to have kosher food so then we could sell it to the Jewish people also. And I don't think in the history of the Jewish people it has ever been as comfortable, luxurious, easy, whatever word you want to use, to have a kosher home as it is today in the United States. Now, on the other side of the ledger, and there always is another side, the world is never 100%, was the rise of the conservative movement. And the conservative movement, as I mentioned before, saw itself as the wave of the future. The conservative movement, Jewish Theological Seminary then had a very, very scholarly, observant faculty. Rabbi Shoel Lieberman was the head of the Talmud department. You had Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. You had Hillel Bavli. You had Rabbi Finkelstein. These were all observant Jews. The joke, was a sarcastic joke, was that the seminary was a place that had an Orthodox faculty to train conservative rabbis to serve a Reform laity. As in all jokes, there's a kernel of truth. And the line between the conservative and the Orthodox was not that defined. It was blurred. And in fact, many Orthodox rabbis sent their children who wanted to go into the rabbinate to the seminary, because that was where the future of the American rabbinate, so to speak, lay. And the 1950s was the heyday of the conservative movement, which in our time is suffering greatly. Also, the break came, I think the real break with Orthodoxy came when the neighborhoods changed and the Jewish people became suburban or spread out. In Chicago, for instance, the Lawndale area, you had 60,000 Jews compressed into a small area. Everybody could walk to where they were going to go. There was no question of driving. But now, for instance, if you move to the suburbs and everybody had a home on a third or a half an acre, so there were people that lived 4 or 5 miles from the synagogue. How are they going to get there? How are they going to attend on Shabbos? So the conservative movement made a fateful decision. So we only see it in hindsight. I don't know if they had to do it over again, what would happen, but it's, the history doesn't allow for do-overs. And they wrote a long halachic treatise, somehow justifying driving an automobile on Shabbat, but it justified it only in driving it to the synagogue. Well, people are not that easily convinced. If you can drive it to the synagogue, why can't you drive it to the supermarket or to the golf course or to see my grandmother? If there's nothing wrong in driving the car to the synagogue, then what's wrong in driving the car anywhere else? And what happened was the destruction of the Sabbath as far as the conservative movement was concerned. And it has continued until today. Orthodoxy voted for the Sabbath over the synagogue. We could live without the synagogue. And you see that we have lived without it for the past few months. It's not pleasant. It's not ideal. It's not the way it's supposed to be. But attending the synagogue is not the secret of Jewish survival. But the Sabbath is. And the desecration of the Sabbath, the sacrifice of the Sabbath in order to save the synagogue was a fundamental and tragic error. Because then at the end, 100 years later, not 100, but it's 70 years later, you have neither the synagogue nor the Sabbath. The other topic I want to discuss with you is the state of Israel. I don't know if any of the other things, even of the rebirth of Torah in American Jewish life, would have occurred had it not been for the creation of the state of Israel. Because the state of Israel straightened our backs. It gave us a feeling of confidence, especially since Israel somehow survived when it was not supposed to survive. And somehow became successful when it was not supposed to be successful. And somehow retained its Jewish values and its Jewish identity, even in the face of its own secularism. And this was a rallying point for the Jewish people. And it gave American Jewry a cause that for a long period of time united it. And the thrust to support the state of Israel was enormous. Now, even in the United States, the reform movement, for instance, was never really pro-Israel. As late as the 1960s, there still were reform temples in the United States that would not make a fundraising drive for Israel bonds, for instance. And on the other extreme, there were those in the Orthodox camp that couldn't reconcile themselves to the creation of a democratic secular state that did not meet its messianic expectations. But the vast majority of American Jews, in the middle, were strong supporters. And they were supporters in terms of wealth, influence, and of political influence. I've always felt that the political influence of the Jewish people in America is exaggerated, but nevertheless it's perceived. And many times we know that perception is just as important, if not more important, than reality. So the perception was, and therefore the state of Israel always had support from the American government, bipartisan support. It was not a political issue. And if it were not for American support, Israel would not have achieved what it's been able to achieve. But in the 1950s, for instance, there was the Sinai campaign in 1956 that Israel participated in and defeated Egypt and came to the Suez Canal for the first time. So there were Jews in America, and I myself was one of them, who felt that was not nice. Jews are always supposed to be nice. And here, the Jews were aggressive. They were preemptive. They did something that was not nice. And I remember then I had an issue that I had to see a medical specialist who was not at all a religious Jew. And I imagine I said to him that, you know, that why did Israel do this? And he laced into me. He set me straight. He said, Jewish people are not going to take it like this anymore. We're not just going to go away quiet. You should be proud of Israel. Don't hold it to unrealistic standards, which is a great lesson. You cannot hold people, and certainly not the Jewish people, and certainly not the Jewish state, to unrealistic standards, to a fantasy world that doesn't exist. It's a world where everything is perfect. Since Israel is not perfect, so, you know, I can write critical articles about it and critical letters to the editor, and I don't have to support it because it's not perfect. Well, I think we all realize that nothing in life is perfect. And that that sort of treatment of the state of Israel is counterproductive, wrong, and ultimately self-destructive. You know, in the 1950s, whatever the New York Times wrote was Bible. I shouldn't say Bible, it was gospel. So whatever they wrote. And the Times has always been against us. It was against the Orthodox, so we immediately became ultra-Orthodox. No, fanatics. And the state of Israel is too aggressive. And I think that one of the great weaknesses of the Jewish community in the 1950s is that it believed the New York Times. The New York Times has not been correct on anything in 100 years, from the American Civil War on. But it's the Bible, right? And the Jewish people were very susceptible to it. And in the 1950s, because of the influence, the political influence was that Franklin D. Roosevelt was somehow the best thing that ever happened to the Jewish people. Now, by now we know better, or we should know better. But in the 1950s, I remember when Roosevelt died, I was 9 or 10 years old, 11 years old maybe. Everybody on the street in the Jewish neighborhood wept. It was like your best friend, your relative. And there's no question that had Roosevelt lived, the state of Israel would not have come into being. And the Auschwitz was never bombed. But this was an inheritance, a legacy, which still exists until today. So in the 1950s, the Jewish vote was taken for granted already. And once you're taken for granted, then you lose influence. And not to participate in supporting the Jewish lobby, which was then the Democratic Party, well, that was considered to be anathema. Well, you couldn't even say it. And that colored the, took a long time for us to outgrow the New York Times. It took a long time for us to realize, you know, for instance, the sign of yichus, that you made it in life, was that the person's obituary appeared in the New York Times. New York Times used to have a big obituary section, and people paid to list whoever their relative was that passed away, God forbid, but you had an obituary in the Times. And if the Times wrote 3 lines about you, wow. It took a long time to get over that. And if you look at the Jewish world today, you see the effects of that. And all of that began in the 1950s. So like in all times, as Dickens said, it was the best of all times and the worst of all times, the 1950s. It saw the rebirth of the Jewish people in America. It saw the day school movement, the yeshivas, OU Kashras, MCSY, all sorts of great things. And it was negative. But out of it has emerged, I think, a very strong Jewish people in the United States based upon the values of Torah and the traditions of Israel. And we should try to strengthen it and continue it and appreciate it and be grateful. Ashreinu, matov chelkeinu, manoim goraleinu, how special we are. So I want to thank you all for listening, and I hope that you're all well and continue to be well, and we'll hear good news one from another. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi WEIN. That was wonderful. What a great trip down Orthodox memory lane, and I'm sure that I know everyone enjoyed it as much as I did. For those of you who couldn't join us live, or perhaps you came in late, or you want to enjoy it again, the recording will be sent to you from my email either later today or tomorrow. So when you get that email, the link for recording will be right there, and all you have to do is put that in your browser. You don't have to request it. Anybody who registered will get that email. We want to thank our partnering shuls who have been promoting the program for us. If any of you did not see your shul listed, please speak to your rabbi or president, and we're happy to have them join us, and we'll give them the information ahead of time for each program.
Thank you.
Next week, we will be having social media on Tuesday, understanding and how to get onto social media. And we will be doing Understanding Dementia, Part 2, back by popular request on Thursday. I want to wish everybody a good Shabbos, be safe, be healthy, and we look forward to seeing you on Tuesday. Take care. Thank you again for joining us.
Hi, honey. How are you? I'm sorry.
No, you're fine.